The Allegory of Earth. Without a name, the black-draped figure I call life's knowledge, and with a name, Sikah. I call him the agnostic priest, arising from the dead, while the dead sleep with the gain of the world. And yet we, on the parapet of life, move on, guided by the light of hope. Fools, your reward is neither here nor after. Yet pleasure standeth by your priest. Take what you can of her, yet you pay your full. The pleasure in pleasure is the expectation of the actual, but the actual is a crude awakening from the blindness, while that jester knowledge exposes death only, and the mirror of truth reveals naught but evolution. This I will call a rehearsal of thought.
That piece was written by Austin Osman Spare from his book Earth Allegory. Hello and welcome to Occult Lives, where this show will be discussing the artist, writer, illustrator, the radio maker and magician known as Austin Osman Spare. I have with me Gavan Kearney, artist and musician, and we're going to be discussing the art of Austin. Mm-hmm. So, over to you, Gavin. What would you like to say?
Well, I first became aware of Austin Osman Spare about 11 years ago. On the advice of a friend, I went to an exhibition in a gallery in Bond Street. I'd never seen his work, and I was immensely impressed by it, by his craftsmanship and his originality. But I think the thing that impressed me the most was that I'd never heard anything of him. I'd never heard of this artist. And it's his complete and utter absence from the kind of anthological or canonical appraisal of art, that I find kind of both kind of, in a way, fishing to the mystery of the man, the kind of obtuseness and the fact that he is a very kind of, like, say, strange peripheral character. But also, I find it dismaying because he has a great talent and he deserves to be seen and, celebrated. I don't think he's entirely completely outside of genres that as an artist on his own. He appears to me to tie in very, very closely to the symbolist movement, stylistically and in terms of his themes and his interests. The symbolist movement was prevalent throughout the late 19th and early 20th century.
Which would have been his time, wouldn't it?
Very much so, yeah, absolutely. One of the, I suppose, the distinguishing features of the symbolist art movement were an interest in the subtle, the suggestive, the nuanced, but also very, very common is the presence of the occult, the supernatural and the spiritual. What's very, very interesting about this is the symbolist period arrived, it seemed to correspond with the kind of celebration of industrialization, of mass wide-scale industrialization, and it seems like, humanity had been given, 150 odd, maybe 200 years of Enlightenment values, the materialist interpretation of the world, and said, thanks but no thanks. Give us mystery, give us the kind of, like, say, the interconnectedness of things, give us kind of, like, say, a non-fixed system, give us the subtlety, give us the nuances. And this is what the French symbolist poet Paul Verlaine wrote about, light and shade. It's the things that are in between things, without the definition and the rigid structural approach of a materialist reading of reality. It seems to me the Spare fits in very, very strongly with this. And it's confusing that he is completely omitted, particularly as, most kind of, I have several books on symbolism, and most will kind of include the pre-Raphaelite movement and the English symbolist artists. One would definitely expect to see Austin Osman Spare there, but it's interesting because a little bit like Aleister Crowley, who is also, like Spare, I think, seen as a very isolated figure, very, very innovative, very, very important and influential. But if one looks at, like, say, for example, France of the late 19th century, there are quite a few characters who would be, say, similar to Aleister Crowley. There is Josephine Paladin, who names himself the Tsar Paladin, who founded the Salon de la Rose Cruz. who was apparently an occultist, an aesthete. There was the author J.K. Huysmans, who was not only an author, a journalist, and who wrote extensively about, say, the occult and Satanism. Like Crowley, actually, both men were kind of. They invited very, very partisan responses. People either admired them or really intensely disliked them. Quite a lot of people, like Crowley, considered these two French, one was Dutch, one was French, considered them to be charlatans and posers. But what I'm saying is that Crowley, a little bit like Spare, isn't totally on his own. There was a precedent. There is a kind of, like, say, certainly it was just more common, I think, in continental Europe. And I wonder how much of this would be to do with the kind of the period of time that, say, Spare and Crowley arose out of. This would have been the height of the British Empire, which was celebrated very, very much with the music of Gilbert and Sullivan, not of Debussy or Stravinsky, or the Wagnerian aesthetic that was very, very popular in continental Europe and fed into, say, the symbolism and the emergence of modern art. And also, as well, of course, if you consider Wagner, who was a kind of, considered the Ring Cycle is the kind of epitome in many ways of Norse or pagan, if not pantheistic music. It's the celebration of the occult, or the spiritual, or certainly the non-material. And if you compare that to kind of, I'm not knocking Gilbert and Sullivan, but it's very kind of no nonsense. There's no kind of none of this sort of, what is this, windy occult business, So you can see in a way how Spare, like Crowley, would have been at an angle. It would have been kind of in opposition in a way to the society. I mean, I'm not kind of, like, say, excluding, say, the Pre-Raphaelites here, or, say, Swinburne or Oscar Wilde. But it seems to me that certainly with Austin Osman Spare, his place, it's still kind of, we're still waiting, or we're kind of, it's his exclusion is marked and it's notable, and it's curious and it's worthy of examining and talking about, perhaps.
Yeah, and also in his time, Spare was quite well known. His art was much admired. It wasn't until he was in his 30s, I think, that he sort of lost a bit of ethos or whatever. And then he had a bit of a comeback. But his art, maybe it was because he was so young and he was being compared to Beardsley and various other artists,
Ricketts,
and he was seen to be the next big artist of the time.
Yeah.
And he, like I say, he was at the beginning. He had a lot of famous people buying his stuff, and he started off quite a few different magazines, art magazines, which again was seen as part of the Art Nouveau, I suppose, maybe.
Yeah.
Which people like Bernard Shaw bought, and he had W.B. Yeats had poetry in and things. So it is weird that now, not even during these last few years, he was forgotten or seemed to be, like you say, neglected from the art chronicles.
That's right.
When he made such an impression at the time, which would have been the late 1800s into the early 1900s, wouldn't it? That's
right, yeah. And there's a correlation, I think there's a correlation with the Russian composer and mystic Alexander Scriabin, who was around the same time he died in 1915. But by the time, he was a contemporary, by the way, of Rachmaninoff, who is far, far better known. Wasn't the case at the time, but at the time of Scriabin's death, he was immensely, well, I won't say popular because his music was quite challenging, but he was considered one of the most important artists in the world at the time. And there was a Scriabin Society in England as well. He was internationally recognised. But not long after his death, like Austin Osman Spare, he was kind of overtaken by this obscurity. And I think actually one of the reasons this could actually be similar with Spare, but one of the reasons with Scriabin was what happened I think after the First World War, a lot of the interest in the kind of, like, say, a spiritual or material reality. In fact, a lot of spirit was just knocked out of people just by the kind of, like, say, the triumph of mechanized warfare. And there was a shift in fashion, one certainly found in say, Western classical music or European classical music. There was a shift towards irony, there was a shift towards a more playful, kind of, like, say, jazz-influenced aesthetic, and also towards very, very abstract structures. And Scriabin was completely written off as this kind of windy megalomaniac mystic, and so there could be a certain amount of that as well with, in terms of, like, say, with Spare's obscurity, being that it's simply too strong a meat for a kind of like a purely materialist mind to take. And I mean, apparently he has been kind of like hailed as a proto-surrealist, but the surrealists tend to actually claim everyone as a kind of a proto-surrealist. And I mean, I'm sure a surrealist would probably shoot me down for this. I would kind of disagree. I would say that he's closer to the symbolist movement. One of the reasons is because surrealism tends towards a kind of a post-Freudian or psychoanalytical approach, as opposed to a kind of an occult or kind of mystical or spiritual based approach. So I would see him, like, you know, like, say, Georges de Chirac, who was also claimed as a proto-surrealist, as being closer to the symbolist movement. But I think that fashion, perhaps, and the change in the culture, perhaps, would have contributed to this obscurity.
Because with the war, after the war, everyone needed, like, uplifting, but not something that they could have to digest into and try and figure out what it all meant, because they were all tired out from such a horrible war.
Yeah.
But Spare himself, I think he wasn't, if I'm right, I'm sure he didn't like the surrealist movement.
No, apparently not.
So later, some people tried to bring him in as the first English artist in surrealism. So he might have tried to jump on that bandwagon just to get him a bit of fame.
Don't blame the chap,
Because I think he thought there wasn't enough mysticism in surrealism.
Yes.
He didn't see it as looking into what the real meaning of life and the mysteries are.
Yeah.
It was too, surreal.
And also too stuck in this kind of in a materialist take on reality, because I think, you know, like you were saying, like after the war, people would have wanted to kind of, like, say, perhaps a more expedient, or maybe light-hearted. I'm not sure. It's funny actually, like, because I was mentioning kind of Scriabin, who was very much influenced by Theosophy and Madame Blavatsky. And
who Spare was as well. He read all of Blavatsky's books.
Did he really?
Yes, he was very much into the Theosophy. I'm working on the ledgers at the moment at the Theosophy Society. I want to find out if he ever became a member.
Yeah.
But it is known that he sat up all night reading her books.
Yeah.
He was absolutely taken by them.
That's excellent. Yeah, I'm really, really glad to hear that. And it is very, very interesting how, I mean, I have this kind of, I've already sort of talked about, I'm kind of this fixed idea about how the late 19th century and the early 20th century saw this great blossoming in kind of, like, say, mysticism or magic or religion or spirituality. And in many ways they seem to be directly in response to the world being divested of its mystery by the scientific process and by materialism and by the kind of like wide-scale industrialization that was making the land something that there wasn't, something that one didn't actually have a relationship with. One simply lived off and saw it as a kind of a source of resort, or as a resource or something like that.
Because Spare would have seen Borough, where he was born and grew up. He saw that change into industrialisation, and I think he found that quite depressing. Yeah.
I mean, another interesting thing as well, you see, about Spare is that, I mean, I wouldn't want to make too big a thing of it, but because he seems to have been from different origins, to say in terms of class, to a lot of kind of, certainly most artists who kind of, like, say, garnered some kind of success or acclaim at any time. Actually, things haven't changed that much, really. Let's be frank. I don't know. Do you think that would actually have any bearing on his obscurity?
Yeah, I think it probably would, because I think he had the opportunity to go and paint portraits of some of the most famous people and probably make a good living from it. But instead he wanted to paint, the prostitutes down the road, the men on the wheelbarrows or the market stalls and things like that. He wanted to stay a man of the streets, didn't he? Yeah.
And that interesting thing as well, like where there was, I remember seeing some of his art or some of his works where you had men in the pubs, these labourers in the pubs as satyrs. So he was seeing
Yes.
the magic. He was actually seeing the magical in absolutely everything, which is beautiful. I think that's fantastic. You know, he would see the satyr-like qualities in these men in the pub, perhaps
Yeah.
being a little bit lascivious. I think it's great.
And then he'd have women with great big wings, and because he did a lot of female nudes,
Yeah.
which may have been part of why he was sort of forgotten about. 'Cause a lot of it turned a bit indiscreet, maybe, or gross,
Yes,
or whatever.
yeah.
But some of his nude paintings are just beautiful women, or
Yeah.
everyday women. They weren't models like, you know, you've got your Victoria, whatever, that does all the bras and knickers models. They were everyday women,
Yeah.
curvy women,
Yeah, they look
women
like
of the
real women.
street.
Yeah,
Yes, he
yeah,
liked
absolutely.
to paint old women, didn't he?
Yeah, yeah.
He got a lot of pensioners to get their clothes off so he could paint them in nudes, but he was looking for that natural look and the
Yeah.
natural woman.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he was a fascinating artist in his humanity. Actually, there's a lot of pathos in his portraits. In fact, actually, you have this thrilling combination of a kind of a misanthropic, acerbic quality, but also a tenderness. There's a tenderness in a lot of his portraits. I mean, I think so. I mean, I don't know. We tend to see what we want to see in everything, you know. But I see this very kind of puckish, kind of like a playful misanthropy, but also a sort of a kindness too, a kindness or a sympathy towards his sitters. That, you know, that the story, whether it's true or not, about Hitler wanting a portrait from him. I wonder if one of the reasons why if this story is true, that he refused is that he didn't like Hitler. Well, I mean, I often get this sense that he only did portraits of people that he actually liked.
Well, he didn't like Hitler, and apparently Hitler did ask. He'd done a self-portrait, and no one knows whether it was because he'd had his little tash. Then this is Spare was wearing a little tash, and he and done a self-portrait and he does have a resemblance to Hitler, doesn't he, Mr.
Yeah.
Spare? He
Yeah.
does have that little face like Hitler, and one of Hitler's generals or someone bought that portrait and took it to Hitler, and Hitler did request him to come out to Berlin and
Really?
paint a picture of him.
Yeah.
And Spare actually sent him a letter saying, you know, absolutely not, I don't like your values or your views or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think there's an element of truth to it.
Yeah.
So, but you know, it's just a shame that he kind of is Hitler's double.
Yeah.
Well, Spare did actually know Aleister Crowley. They met when Aleister read a review of Austin Spare's work. It was being shown at the Bruton Gallery, and in the review, Spare was paralleled with Aubrey Beardsley, and one of the reviewers said that Spare's work was an inventive art, is stupendous and yet terrifying in its creation and its flow of impossible horrors. And Crowley read this and obviously decided this was the man for him, and shot down to the gallery and walked in and announced himself as the vice regent of God on earth. And Crowley and Spare hit it off straight away. But the thing is, Spare was quite a shy man, wasn't he? He was, and obviously Crowley has got one hell of a reputation, and he was quite a character.
Yeah.
And he made a big impression on Spare, enough so that Spare actually started doing quite a bit of artwork for Crowley in Crowley's magical magazines, and he also joined Crowley's magical order, the Argentum Astrum. So I often wonder whether his reputation of being a friend of Crowley's, even though after a few years he did go off Crowley and didn't want to hang out with him, but I wonder if that did damage his reputation, because at that time Crowley himself had a bit of reputation and was known as the Beast, and you know, he was the bad man in the newspapers and things. So you know, I was just wondering what you thought about that with Crowley's and Spare's relationship.
It's hard to say, because sadly, I mean, the only people I've met who are familiar with Austin Osman Spare are people who are familiar with Aleister Crowley.
And no magicians normally.
Yeah, absolutely, you know. So, and it's very, very difficult, and also we'd have to try to imagine the kind of, like, say, or kind of like put our minds into the cultural mores and the morals of the time. So, you know, because after all, Aleister Crowley, his reputation, he certainly made an impact. It's got to be said that he was better at self-promotion, considerably better at self-promotion than Austin Osman Spare. And something that does come across, possibly, I mean, I wonder, with the parting, whether it was not so much a falling out, just that Spare wouldn't have been in orbit of anyone. Spare wouldn't have been anyone's acolyte. And I think that Crowley had the kind of personality that invited subordinates, if that makes sense. They could have been kind of like, say, it could have been Beardsley and Wilde, Spare and Crowley. It could have been. But I just think that, actually, no, I was saying that it could have been, but of course Beardsley and Wilde fell out as well for very, very well, what I would imagine to be similar reasons. That is, Beardsley felt that Wilde would consume everyone around him, and Wilde actually found Beardsley just too cruel a personality. Wilde, for all of his talk, was just too soft. He wasn't able to, whereas Beardsley was a genuinely quite acerbic character, very, very interesting. The sad thing is, though, that it's the association that I think that it was very, very difficult for Spare to get himself both free of being associated with Crowley and with being Beardsley or post-Beardsley. I mean, I think that the strong, if there is a kind of like, say, a resemblance, technical resemblance to any artist, it's G.F. Watts. But he doesn't stay with that. He very, very quickly, and we got to bear in mind as well, I mean, he was a kid when he was first exhibiting, and he actually progressed.
Only about 16, wasn't
16,
he?
that's
Yeah.
right. And his progress was remarkable and swift, and he actually left his influences very, very early. He developed a style very, very early. But it is interesting that he is mainly, or in the main, kind of like, say, known through the association, through kind of like, say, I don't know, say Crowley, or through
With
magical
the occult
connections,
world.
the occult
Yeah.
world, absolutely.
Because many people said, and I'm pretty sure Alan Moore said, that he thought he was the greatest magician we've ever had.
Yes.
And he was a very powerful magician, Spare, even though he wasn't the sort that showed it off like Crowley did. But he did set up, he knew how to use sigils and symbolism, and he made his own little language, alphabet to use in his magic, which he incorporated into a lot of his paintings, didn't he?
That's
He wrote
right,
them into them.
Yeah.
So, and like what you were saying earlier of him drawing people like their satyrs or angels or whatever, that again was him looking at the magical side of people, wasn't he? Of what there'd be in the mysteries or whatever.
Yeah.
So what do you think about his sigils, or would you think that's part of his artwork that he wanted to show off, or was it just him trying to make magic with his art?
I think that there would be him making magic with his art, but also I think a little bit like him kind of portraying people as satyrs and angels. He was showing, I think that he was aware that there's, the eye takes in so much, and the conscious mind registers so little, so that there was room in his work to put these little codes and keys in. And I think that's one of the reasons why it makes such an impression. Funny, if you don't know, well, I mean, that's something I found, because I mean, I didn't know anything about, I didn't know about his association with magic or with Crowley or anything when I first saw his work. I was just told, well, this is an interesting artist, and I thought, oh, this is very, very impressive. But it had an impact on me that was more than aesthetics, or more than kind of like,
it's like it delved into your subconscious.
Absolutely. And it was working on this. It was working with the subconscious. And here's where I'd go out on a limb. This is a very, very subjective take on things, but it's frankly what I believe one of the potencies of art, or of the arts, is to deal with the subconscious, or to deal with the subliminal, or to deal with the formless, to deal with the states of becoming. That is, before something comes into manifestation. Music does this beautifully because it's entirely abstract, and it's entirely based on, it happens within time. There's a starting point and it ends. And where you'd have, like, say, I don't know, say like a fugue by Bach, you have the development of an idea, one idea germinating and moving and completing itself and closing. To do that in painting is far, far harder. And also as well, of course, this is one of the things you've got to bear in mind with Spare's relative obscurity, the changes in fashion. If Spare was in art school now, he would be condemned as being kitsch, because he because he was concerned with doing largely representational artwork. That is, it's the subjects are it features things that are subjects that are recognizable, but also that it focuses on that state of becoming, where you have one thing morphing into another. It is imaginative, which is the cardinal sin of art. I know this, you see, because I went to art school, and it is the cardinal sin of contemporary art, the academic approach, that is, to do anything that is apolitical, say, for example. And what I mean by that is that isn't tied into a materialist reading of reality.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that isn't tied entirely to a materialist reading of reality is kitsch. So he would be condemned as being kitsch, for being imaginative and stuff like that. And one could just imagine. You see, the thing is, I wonder as well, you see, about how much of his obscurity was self-elected.
I think it was.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was.
Because he was such a shy man and a private man.
Yeah, a very, very private man, and also a man of integrity.
Mm.
You know, he wasn't faking it, and I think that he saw the chicanery and the charlatanism in kind of in operation, not in society as well as in the art world, and just said, you know what, I don't want any part of this. I think that he had too much integrity, and he was too strong a character. He was too strong a character. And the thing is, somebody else might say, yes, but he wasn't strong a character enough to impose himself upon the world. But you know what? He was he was flickering in and out of many realities, and he might have looked at this tiny little reality and said, it's not fucking worth it.
Because it's interesting you say about how when you saw his art, it felt like, I was putting that words into your mouth, of it affecting your subconscious. And
yeah, it did.
Because he said he did his art from the subconscious,
yes.
And he was trying to use his subconscious to make his art, to understand the mysteries and things.
Yeah.
He used to put himself into a trance before he painted. And I know he used to look into a mirror and sort of hyperventilate until he
altered his consciousness.
That's it, yes.
Yeah.
And he also, part of his magic, he had two different words, one for the conscious and one for the subconscious. And I'm embarrassed to not remember what they are, Zeus and something else. But we'll look it up.
We'll look it up. And
we'll look it up and we'll edit it in.
Yeah.
But he used them to meditate on,
yes.
to get to his subconscious, because that's where he wanted to bring his art from.
Yes. This is very, very important as well, you see, Debbie, because it points out a really, really important factor that we need to take into account. Up until relatively recently, and we're talking about like 100 odd years, 120 years, which in the history of mankind and art and culture is nothing. But up until relatively recently, the arts were seen as magical, spiritual activities and artifacts. You know, it's only relatively recently that we've been tied to this, and you know, by their fruits shall you know them. Where you just look at the wonders that win the Turner Prize, say for example, these days, and
wonders. Yeah, sarcastically putting them in quotation marks there.
You know, I mean, the thing is, if only artists like Spare and I don't know, kind of Michelangelo, if only they knew better, you know, they'd put the paints down, they'd have had lights going on and off, and they'd have had piles of bricks and all this edifying garbage. But the thing is, though, it's art and music, particularly if you think of, like, say, music was a ritual that would involve people, like, say, most music, like, say, Western classical music evolved out of spiritual chant, that's, like, say, plain chant, and the dance. That, like, say, you know, if you look at, like, say, you know, in Bach's time, there wasn't kind of like symphonies, there were suites, an orchestral suite. You'd have a jig, which is a jig. You know, you'd have a saraband. So these are the mystical properties of life. The dance being the social interaction, kind of like larger interaction then of the planet in the cosmos. It's only very, very recently that we've actually had this approach to art and culture that's divested of magic and mystery and ritual. And by Christ, don't you see evidence of it?
The state of the world. Yes.
Yeah. You know, and the state of the arts itself. You know, I mean, the thing is, this as well, you see, as I think that timing is crucial. Had Spare, like, I mean, I think, like, if Crowley had been around 30 years beforehand, I wonder how much of his time and energy he would have put into the occult, because I mean, he was very, very gifted in many areas anyway. But I wonder, because he was a very good writer, I wonder would he have, you know, kind of like, say, put kind of more of his kind of like, say, I don't know, focus and self-promotional gifts into promoting himself as a poet. Had Spare been born 30 years beforehand, it might have been a different matter. He may have kind of, like, say, slotted into the culture that was current at the time. But I think that, you know, the era that he was living in, particularly so the last 20 odd years of his life, the world had changed drastically, and very, very much what he would have stood for in terms of art, that was out. The last vestige of kind of academic or classical art would have been, as we know it, would have been found in surrealism. That's because it was dependent upon using symbols that were recognisable in real life. But what was emergent was very, very much abstract expressionism and conceptual art.
Mm-hmm.
Following on from that, pop art, which is has a kind of like an innate sense of irony, and irony is the opposite to the magical or the spiritual, because irony can be funny, but irony is ultimately despair.
Yes.
It's ultimately despair, and Spare, I don't think, did despair.
No.
I don't think he did it. I think that his character was too strong.
He might have despaired at the way that the world was changing, but
absolutely.
he believed in that he could make it a better place.
This is it, and his actions, even his writings that are vitriolic as hell, that is a fight back. That shows a man who's not going down without a fight. He had spirit, you know. He wasn't. I don't think he was capable of cynicism in playing the game, and I think that this as well is one of the reasons, not just his great gifts, but he deserves acclaim. He deserves recognition. So we'll see. It would be wonderful if more people became aware of his work. He definitely deserves it. The fact that that we are still talking about him, though, shows the kind of the depth of the impact that he actually makes, and the genuine quality of his work and of his spirit.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but like you were saying earlier, I wonder if that's because of the people he knew.
Yeah.
Because towards like the last few years of his life, which he was or the last 20 years of his life, he did become a bit of a hermit.
Yes.
And even though he had loads and loads of paintings, sadly his house got hit by a bomb that didn't get off during the war.
Yeah.
And the bomb went straight through the roof, through the floor, and didn't actually explode, but a lot of his work got destroyed because of that damage from that, and he got quite hurt. And they think that he got quite depressed after that. He was a changed man. Became a bit more, well, obviously the shock of losing all your artwork must be, you know, all that life work gone. Because he kept all his work in his room. He had, you know, I don't know, I think it was a 1 or 2 roomed place. And people used to, like journalists used to come and look through his rooms and look at all his artwork. And, you know, and there's accounts of him just having wall-to-wall piles of paintings and drawings and notebooks. He had so many notebooks, which a lot, like I say, got destroyed in that. A lot of got missing. I know one came out in a auction a few years ago that had not been seen for many years. Right. I think it might have been E.M. Foster or somebody fuller. But anyway, a famous author had this book, which turned out to be quite an erotic book of sketches that he'd done. Which apparently he was, after this, or around the time of the World Wars, he started getting into quite indecent artwork. And I know he got a lot of bad reviews for that because... Well, it wasn't the decent thing to be putting that kind of very explicit artwork out. And they think that he was making, possibly what pennies he was making was through selling drawn pornography.
Naughty drawings. It's quite possible because he didn't have recourse to a private income like a lot of the artists at the time would have. You know, it is sad though to think that, kind of like I said, that what happened with the bomb, that would have had such an effect on his character, but of course it would have, because not just, certainly as an artist with an awareness of a magical reality, he is aware of the difficulty of bringing something into manifestation. You see that it's very, very, it's easy to have ideas. It's very, very difficult to kind of motivate yourself and maintain that. Ask anybody who kind of like, say, who's written a book, say, for example, or written a kind of like, say, I don't know, a piece of music, or done a painting that's taken consistency and effort and discipline. You know, you're one of the major satisfactions you have at the end of it, even if you're not happy with the quality of the thing itself, is you've at least done it. It's there. where it wasn't, you know, where there was a void in existence, you filled this little void with something that wasn't there before you, you know. So I can imagine, particularly because he was such a self-contained and private man, that would have his world, that would have been so much of his world and his essence that he would have surrounded himself with. And a large part of his reality, or his sense of self, was perhaps shattered and lost with that. Because he would be aware of the hours, the effort put in, the consistency and the discipline and the dedication, and also the fact that it was his chosen path, that he chose a quiet, lonely path to just work away, to create these wonderful works, and for so many of them to be destroyed like that. I mean, it's quite a crushing thing.
And sadly we've lost quite a few more recently with the Cumming Museum being burnt down,
right.
where a big collection of his artwork was.
Yeah.
I think it was more drawings, but still, you know, it's devastating that we've lost them.
Absolutely, yeah. Actually, he probably did despair, really, to be fair.
Oh, poor Austin Spare, despairing about what he had to spare.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I hope, I mean, I'd like to think that there's kind of, like, say, there's a steady emerging awareness of his work. And I'd like to think it's like despite the kind of, like, say, the dispiriting kind of nature of, like, say, the 24/7 kind of news, work, subsistence world that we live in, that the fact that we remain aware of him, or there's an awareness of him, has remained, and hopefully is growing and increasing, is representative as well of the kind of the capacity for curiosity within humanity, for a curiosity that goes beyond kind of, like, say, what we can quantify. Because after all, I mean, you know, I'm not dismissing science, I'm not dismissing, you know, these people who can do things that I couldn't dream of doing or understanding. But like anything, you can only understand if you have the right tools for it, and it's quite possible that so much of reality we don't know because science just hasn't got there yet. Mm-hmm. And for the human spirit to be constantly striving and looking beyond what's just there. And I hope that the maintenance of interest and increase of interest in Spare is symptomatic not just of the acknowledgement of this great and neglected artist, but also that side of the spirit that's had pretty good kicking now, really, for a couple of 100 years. So
well, I think there'll be probably a resurgence in him, because last year it was apparently his tarot cards were discovered, the ones that he designed, and hopefully they're going to be brought out soon. There's been a lot of talk on the internet whether they really were by him or not. I've not seen them, but I've heard someone that is a big Spare fan, and she believes they are drawn by him. There's also the sigils, the oracle cards, that hopefully maybe someday someone will turn up with a pack of, that he used to design, that he used to sell. And he himself also designed little cards with sigils on for, well, one of them that's been known about is a Stormbringer. And there was I think it was a journalist went to his house once and offered, like, it was when in Spare's later days, so he was poverty stricken, cold, I think he was ill, and that's why he was lying on his bed, and this friend of his offered to clean up the house for him, the flat. And as he was doing it, he found some cards, and he picked one up and he said, "What are these?" And Spare asked him to look at it, and he showed it to him, and it was one of these sigil cards, and Spare went, "That's a Stormbringer." And within a few minutes there was thunder and lightning and heavy rain outside. So you know, if they got found, I'm sure, well, maybe they are hidden away in some government laboratory somewhere.
Absolutely.
But you know, it's strange that with his art he was able to do this kind of magic, but then didn't use it for himself, as to make himself rich, famous.
And again, this is where I'd wonder, because he had insight into these other realities,
so he knew it wasn't important, didn't he?
It wasn't really that important.
Yeah.
And again, it's it contributes to the enduring mythos of Spare, that he could have had a lot more material success, inverted commas, if he chose to, but he chose not to. And it's one of the mysteries, why did he choose not to? I mean, I love that, because I love the idea anyway of somebody completely, because our notion of success is so shrunken and atrophied and so uninspired, that the idea that you have somebody who would actually turn away from it, and also who didn't have recourse, like I said, to a private income or something like that, he knew it would be a bit of a struggle. He chose poverty. You know, I'm not entirely romanticizing him here. You know, I mean, I know that it would. I know that it wouldn't have been as straightforward as somebody offering him £1 million and him saying, "No, I'm above such things." But at the same time, you know, he knew that he could have actually really tried to. And I mean, obviously, he did make a buck here with, you know, here and there with naughty drawings and stuff like that. But as a general principle, it seemed like his life was running to a different script. You know, and one of the, I suppose it's a very, very rare thing these days, because you were talking about these decks, these works of his that might yet turn up. It's a very rare thing in an age of the internet where absolutely everything anyone has done is online and can be found. That's one of the things that I marvel at, like say with a lot of the kind of like say relatively kind of obscure, or I would consider relatively obscure music that I'm into. You can find so much of this stuff online. Everything is there now. It's not like kind of like say hankering back to when I was a lad and you had to rely on what was basically in the mainstream media, which is just kind of like corporate dull stuff, you know. You know, you didn't have kind of like say you weren't able to just access all of this world.
You had to find the obscure shops that would sell that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's it. It wasn't. You see, whereas everything now is kind of available, but Spare isn't. No. Spare is still kind of no. You still have to hunt them out. You still have to hunt this stuff down. It still may turn up somewhere. We don't know what works and what writings might turn up at some stage. And this is a wonderful thing. It's actually very, very intriguing, and it's the gift that keeps on giving in terms of like say an interest in an artist, because it's not a closed thing. There's no boxed set of Spare's entire works. He's not filed off and finished. The story is still going on, which is great.
Yeah, and he'd appreciate that. I think he'd like to be known that he's sort of immortal. His art's immortal. And he's probably out there on the ether somewhere watching us all.
Yeah,
chuckle at it all.
He's probably having a beer and just kind of thinking, no, they don't know.
A beer with all the mystical creatures and the mystical gods.
As long as he has his cats with him as well, you know. And
well, I wanted to call this show Painter with Cats.
Yeah.
Because it is, that's what, I love this wonderful photo of him with lots of cats. Because in his last 10, 15 years of his life, he took in stray cats, didn't he?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And he obviously preferred feline company to humans.
Yeah,
But, you know, for me, that's just that added extra bit about what a kind of guy he was.
Yes.
He loved animals, he cared for them. Yeah. I know he found a cat that had been thrown from a window and he took it to the vets and sadly it had to be put down and it broke his heart.
Yeah,
you know, he cared.
Well, that's it. I mean, he was known to be an animal lover and to be very, very sympathetic, and this is this lovely thing that comes across with him as well. I mean, I love that combination. Anyway, I find it I don't know whether I dare say I relate to it, between being intensely private and misanthropic, but also being empathic and feeling things and desperately wanting to kind of like say redress imbalances or injustices and things like that, you know. And a lot of his disdain I could relate to as being this kind of as being actually a sort of a wounded idealist. And you know, in a way, like he was probably excluded from modernism, as the art movement of modernism, with the exception of symbolism, which is kind of arguably the first kind of like say modernist movement. But at heart a romantic, and a romantic in the broadest sense of that, as being in the place of mysteries and being in the place of overwhelming feelings, and not at all being dictated to by the material needs of the world. And as a consequence of that, one of the most enduring romantic artists.
Because I agree with you on that, and he reminds me so much of William Blake, even though their artwork is very different.
Very different, yes.
But their ideals, well, just
Absolutely.
like what you've just been explaining, they're both for the same kind of people.
Yeah. And this is it. It's like kind of Blake has been recognised and has been acknowledged now. Hopefully the same will happen for Spare.
Though Blake wasn't recognised in his time.
Exactly.
But Spare was for the first 20 years of his artwork. And then sort of, well, that's what we're trying to find out. Why did he get forgotten, bless him?
Yeah.
And whether it was because he dabbled in magic or because his artwork started getting grotesque, or whether he just annoyed some important figures, really. Because I know he did annoy W.B. Yeats in the end, because he didn't get Yeats's poems out in time. And because of that, Yeats lost some of his publishing rights.
Yeah.
So I don't know why he got forgotten, but we're bringing him back. And I was going to just finish off with saying about you've done a song as Sand Snowman, which is your musical name.
Yeah.
And we're going to finish off with that at the end of the show, and that's just called Music for Austin Osman Spare.
That's one of the names for it. Yeah, it's I don't know if it's quite. I don't know if it's quite a song. It's like 12 minutes of sounds. Yeah, it's one of It's because I say that like because when it was initially released, there was no title. There's a bit of confusion. It was on a bonus CD that came out with this other album, and on the bonus CD they printed the wrong titles. Okay, so nobody knew what this thing was called, and it's actually it's Music for Austin Osman Spare.
Well, I think it'd be a nice way to end our show. So I want to thank you for having a chat about Austin Osman Spare.
My pleasure.
And
thank you.
I just want to mention that Moonswift read the Allegory at the beginning of the show, and hopefully we'll do some more shows on Spare soon. Thanks for being part of it.
No problem. Thank you, Debbie.
The Allegory of Earth.